be part of this conference, which I've been part of before, and it's always a rewarding experience. As you know, the title of this panel is Religion and U.S. Presidential Leadership. And what we plan to do in this panel is the following. I am joined on the panel by three colleagues, all of whom their bios are in your program. Jennifer Weber from the Department of History at Princeton, Eisele, the editor of The Hill in Washington, Capitol Hill, and of course David Gergen, to whom we are all indebted for this conference. The way we'll proceed is that I will make some opening remarks that will be thematic in character about this question, and then we will look at three cases, insofar as you can do cases in 10 to 12 minutes, because each of us are taking that. Jennifer Weber will look at Lincoln, Eisele will look at Carter, and David Gergen will look at George W. Bush. As you might guess, there were other possible candidates for this analysis. I really thought long and hard about trying to get the right person on Wilson, but we couldn't do it, and that seemed complicated enough to take a whole conference anyway. So we will stay with these three cases. Let me begin with a couple of remarks that are thematic, framing the question about faith and the presidency. I think the first thing to say is that to discuss this topic today is to discuss it in a changed and changing context. And to highlight the change, let me use 2 points of reference, namely the 1960 election, when of course John F. Kennedy was elected president, and the election of 2004. In the election of 2004, the discussion of religion permeated the entire election period. Not only during the election, but since then. Last night, if any of you were here early, you might have gone to the ARCO Forum in the Kennedy School and heard a lecture entitled Election 204, A Spiritual Awakening, by a evangelical pastor who pastors a church with 80,000 people in Orange County and who has a book that has sold 20 million copies in the last 2 years. Now, when I was a graduate student here, the ARCO Forum did not feature spiritual awakening discussions. And so to some degree, there's a major change, even in this forum. But the change was deeper than that. The New York Times magazine section featured an article on President Bush's faith. Newsweek featured an article on Senator Kerry's character. I think it was over 70% of the American public said they thought faith was an important characteristic for them in judging a presidential candidate. And if from another side of the question there was a discussion of if someone were an atheist, could they get elected in the United States? All of this permeated the discussion. Think back to 1960, a very different kind of setting for religion and politics. On the 40th anniversary of John Kennedy's death in 2003, the New York Times editorial memorializing Kennedy said that Kennedy's election had settled the religious issue in American politics. That did seem to be an overstatement of the question. That is to say, it settled a question, could a Catholic be elected president, but it seemed not to settle the issue of religion and politics. If anything, an alternative judgment would be that the issue today is far more pervasive and indeed is perceived as much more complex. The fact that it's far more pervasive, the role of religion in presidential politics, is troubling to many, mobilizing to perhaps just as many, and confusing to others. That is to say, the reaction to this question in its diversity is part of what needs to be analyzed. The differences between 1960 and 2004, just if one looks at this almost at the surface of things. Religion and politics in 1960, I think, was regarded as an intrusion of religion into the political arena. Kennedy himself, for sure, tried to marginalize the issue. And when he finally addressed it openly and publicly, he did it against the advice of his advisors, if we are to trust the several biographies of Kennedy. His speech in Houston to the Ministerial Alliance was regarded as both necessary because the issue had become so significant and a huge risk. Kennedy solved the question by radically separating religion and politics. The purpose of his speech was to answer the question, could a person with his religious conviction, in a sense, be trusted in the American constitutional setting? And he answered the question on the whole by saying that while he held his faith and would not repudiate it, the content of his faith would not significantly or perhaps at all influence the way he would decide questions, and therefore the issue should not be a public fact of the election. In 2004, the issue was less how you insulated or isolated faith, but how you related it. How would a person's faith shape their choices? Now, the final comment, I think, of this is simply that this quick summary of a time when separation solved the question, and a discussion today about how relationship may be the question. A quick summary of that, I think, might be made in terms of 2 points. First, the levels of this question, religion and politics. I think there are 3. There's a personal level that tends to be about character. Voters asking whether they should include religious judgments in assessing the character of candidates. Secondly, an institutional question, and the language of that is the language of the courts, the classical line drawing about church and state. It is a distinct question from the personal question, but not unrelated to it. And finally, in addition to the personal and institutional levels, there is what you might call the social level. That is to say, not what the character of candidates are, not how the institution of religion relates to the institution of government, but how in the social level one thinks about policy choices, whether they be war and peace, biomedical ethics, or questions of marriage and various forms of civil relationships. Regarding gender, how religion should or should not relate to those questions. If those are the levels of the question, the final point, I think, is how one might structure this discussion. If you ask about the relationship of religion and politics, I think there are 3 broad options. You can try to separate it drastically and divide the 2. In one sense, that was reflected in the Kennedy speech. You can try to collapse it and totally integrate it. That is to say, have the discussion flow freely back and forth. But that raises questions about what the institutional history of this country, the distinction between religion and government, means if you collapse the 2. For myself, I would pose a third way of thinking about it. Rather than thinking about religion and politics in direct dialogue, think about the relationship of religion, morality, and politics. The reason for that, I think, is twofold. First of all, moral discussion about policy issues obviously must be a concern of all citizens. Some people draw their moral convictions from religious traditions. Others form deep moral convictions without the assistance of religious traditions at all. So if you, in a sense, mediate the religion and politics discussion through the moral argument, it opens up ground on which people of religious and non-religious backgrounds can stand to discuss normative choices in the political order. Secondly, if you look at most of the issues that get included in the discussion of religion and politics, the so-called moral issues post-election, they are moral questions which may be relying upon religious conviction to bring to conclusions in the minds of some, but they stand as, in a sense, distinctly moral and not purely, in any sense, religious. And then thirdly, if you mediate the religion and politics discussion through the moral order, then you can raise some tests about how one should talk about the normative dimensions of political issues. What kind of reasons should one bring to bear, not simply because one holds them deeply, but reasons that would serve as valid for a secular, pluralistic, democratic country to describe and defend its moral choices in the public arena. We now will move from this general discussion to very specific examination of faith and the presidency, and Jennifer Weber will speak first.
Okay, well, talking about Abraham Lincoln and religion is actually much harder than it would seem to be on the surface. The problem here is that Abraham Lincoln clammed up about his own religious beliefs in the mid-1840s, and we never heard anything more about them again, directly. So that leaves us with having to draw inferences from his speeches and his letters. That has led to a great deal of confusion and multiple claims on Lincoln's spiritual life by everybody from fundamentalist Christians to atheists, from the Masons to psychics, that he was a follower of theirs. Jews have claimed him as the modern Moses, and Christians have claimed him as the American Jesus. Historians themselves have been debating this issue for 6 generations now, and for those of you who saw the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, you realize that this debate is alive and well. What I think that we can all agree on, though, is that Lincoln was an intensely moral and ethical man. And these two belief systems drove many of his decisions. Lincoln was also a self-made man, and by that I mean not just in the financial sense, but also in this moral and ethical realm. Lincoln, I think more than any other president in American history, is a work in progress throughout his life. You cannot take any single moment of Lincoln's life and say that it is representative of the entire span of his life. So what I'm going to do this morning is briefly try to cover Lincoln's spiritual journey. Lincoln grows up in an Orthodox Baptist household. The family belonged to a church that, as one historian has said, would have out-Calvined Calvin. It's extremely conservative, one that believes that melancholy is the proper human condition. It advocates predestination and believes that humans are helpless before God. When Lincoln left his father's house, he also left organized religion for good. He went to New Salem, Illinois, where at best I think you can say that he was a theist. He was deeply involved in reading the Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire, Volney, Paine. At worst, you could call him an atheist, and with some justification. In both New Salem and Springfield, he was known to go around town calling Jesus a bastard. If this was for shock value, it worked. He also was known for sport in Springfield to open the Bible to any random passage and start dismantling the Bible's claims using his own considerable powers of logic. But as I said, Lincoln stopped his public commentary on religion in 1846. This is a moment where he is running for Congress, and he was accused by his opponent of being an infidel. Then, as now, that can be a political liability. And in order to save his political viability, as a later president would call it, Lincoln stopped talking about religion altogether. He did make numerous allusions to God in the years before he became president, but it seems more to have been a nod to the cultural environment than a reflection of any deep-held belief on his part. I think this all changes during his presidential years. And I think that he becomes spiritual, though not religious. He never joins a church, he's never baptized. But he does seem to have an increasingly profound relationship with God, with a creator. And when he talks, the terms of his discussion change dramatically. There are historians who believe that Lincoln was an atheist and that he remained an atheist during his years as president, that his discussions of God were a political ploy. And here I disagree. I think that he has a genuine transformation that is a response to a searing set of events, including the war and the loss of his favorite child. I think these two issues drive him to look for explanations and for means of understanding. And that gives him a new vocabulary that ultimately allows him to explain the war and its meaning to Americans. So when does all this start? Again, another source of debate. My own feeling is that it starts really upon his election. And you see it in his farewell address in Springfield in February of 1861. He's been elected president, and 7 southern states have left the Union in direct response to his election. He tells the people who've lived in this town where he's lived for 25 years now, without the assistance of the divine being, I cannot succeed. With that assistance, I cannot fail. Trusting in him who can go with me and remain with you, and be everywhere for good, let us confidently hope that all will yet be well. To his care commending you, as I hope in your prayers you will commend me. I bid you an affectionate farewell. Now, there is a depth of feeling here, but it's nothing like we're going to see later in the war. And you come several weeks later to his first inaugural address, which is principally an appeal to logic, a promise to Southerners that the North will not open fire on them. There are allusions to God, but again, these don't seem to have much depth of feeling. So what changes from 1861 to 1862 when he really starts to exhibit these signs of a true depth of feeling, even beyond what we saw in the Springfield speech? Well, in February 1862, he loses his son Willie, who was 11 at the time, to typhoid fever. And in the subsequent months and years, the war came home to Lincoln in an extremely personal sense. His wife, Mary, lost 3 half-brothers and a brother-in-law, all of whom were Confederate soldiers. And Lincoln himself takes on the suffering of the nation. He experiences these personal losses, but I think that he also has a deep sense of responsibility, if not for secession, perhaps not for the beginning of the war. As commander-in-chief, I think he has a very deep sense of responsibility for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of young men. And he starts to search for solace. In September 1862, he writes a little note to himself. It's a private wrestling. He calls it the Meditation on Divine Will. And this also really is very representative of Lincoln's logical powers. I'll read most of it. This fragment, incidentally, is found in his desk drawer after his death. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be, and one must be, wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present Civil War, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party. I am almost ready to say that this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not yet end. Having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day, yet the contest proceeds. This new depth of feeling allows Lincoln to articulate a new vision for the nation. And you see this most clearly and most publicly beginning in November of 1863 with the Gettysburg Address. Now, this is a speech that is not terribly religious on its surface. He cites God once in kind of a castaway sort of way. But if you think about the speech itself, it's highly Christian in its language, 7 years ago. And it really touches on the fundamental Christian themes of birth, death, and rebirth. Except rather than describing this as an individual experience, Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address is describing this as a national experience. By the spring of 1864, hundreds of thousands of men were dead, and Lincoln had long since given up any idea that he was in charge. He wrote to a Kentucky editor, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." And here, by this time, I think that you start to see echoes of his childhood religion, that God is in charge, that God has a plan, and that man must submit to it. Then we get the second inaugural address in March 1865. This has been called Lincoln's greatest speech, and it is probably his most overtly religious. It's an appeal from the heart. It's not about reason, and it has numerous direct references to God in the Bible. It's an explanation of what has happened to the United States, and a template for where the country should go from that point. Lincoln talks about slavery and retribution. It's an Old Testament view of the world that he presents. He says that God gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense of slavery came. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid with another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so it must still be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And then he immediately moves to a New Testament view of forgiveness and mercy. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan. And note here that he's not talking just about Union soldiers. He's being consciously nonspecific. To do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. This speech captures Lincoln beautifully. It captures his own sense of suffering and of the nation's suffering. It offers a deeper understanding of the human condition than Lincoln had ever spoken of before, and probably that many Americans had ever thought of themselves. Lincoln is more empathetic here than he had ever been, which is saying something quite considerable. Lincoln had come to have a fundamentally spiritual view of the world. And all these themes come together in the second inaugural address. These are also his legacies for the rest of us. Thank you.
Al Eisele.
Thank you, Bryan. I should start off by pointing out that as someone who spent much of his career as a journalist covering Hubert Humphrey, it is almost impossible to ask me to give a 12-minute presentation. As instead of Humphrey, it took him 12 minutes to clear his throat. And as they also said of him in Minnesota, what comes after a Humphrey speech on Saturday night? The answer is Sunday morning. I want to start out with a couple of personal references here. I'm glad to be back, happy to be back here. I was a fellow in the Institute of Politics in 1982. A couple of years after President Reagan kicked Vice President Mondale, Jimmy Carter, and me out of the White House. It was a great experience, and I always look forward to coming back here. My last visit to this hotel was during the Democratic Convention last year, and I came back after Glenn Close had given a speech introducing Bill Clinton. Of course, he gave his speech, and I talked my way into a Fat Cat's reception in the Noir Bar afterwards, and it was a reception for President Clinton and Hillary Clinton. And as they came in, I happened to be talking to somebody that Clinton knew, and he made a beeline for him, Walter Shorenstein. And then I introduced myself, and I said, you know, we write a lot about your wife in the Senate. And he spent the next 5 minutes holding me there, telling me what a great job Hillary was doing in the Senate, and all these other fat cats were trying to get to talk to him, and he kept shoving them aside. So the secret, if you want to talk to him, is talk about his wife. Two other personal references. One, I particularly enjoyed Jennifer Weber's comments about Lincoln. I have become a Civil War buff by osmosis because my older daughter Kitty, who's now at National Public Radio, was the producer of Ken Burns' Civil War series and won an Emmy for that. My younger daughter Anne, who and I know a couple of the two previous presentations had to deal with corporate values and responsibility. My younger daughter Anne is Director of Communications for Boeing Corporation in Chicago, and they have been through a horrendous year of problems. And the other morning, Monday morning, as I'm getting ready to go to work, she called me and said, "Dad, I want to give you a heads up that today we're going to announce that Harry Stonecipher, who's the CEO, has been asked to resign by the board because he had an inappropriate relationship with a Boeing woman executive." And she said, "The second thing I wanted to assure you is that I was not that executive." I'm glad to see Linda Peake here, who is a former colleague of mine in the Mondale administration. I'm sure she's going to ask some probing questions. And also to see Joe Nye, who's written two terrific books, one on foreign policy, which I'm reading, and another very good sexy crime novel, detective novel, which I'm also reading, which may get reviewed in The Hill. I probably have the easiest task of any of the people on the panel today because I can't think of any president who has spoken more openly and often and written more prolifically about his religious beliefs and values and how they affected his actions in public office than Jimmy Carter. The closest parallel I can think of is Woodrow Wilson, and there are parallels, but there are enormous differences as well. They come out of different religious traditions and so forth. Interestingly, both of them ended their presidencies in rather difficult circumstances. As Bryan has noted, if you read my biography, I was privileged to work for Vice President Mondale and had the opportunity to work in close proximity with President Carter and his top aides during the 4 years of the Carter-Mondale administration. One of my more vivid memories is shortly after they took office, there was a photograph taken at one of the first weekly lunches that President Carter and Vice President Mondale had, just the two of them, and they're showed bowing their heads in prayer before the meal. And I think that photograph captured as well as anything I could think of as of Carter's deep and genuine religious nature. I have great admiration for President Carter, both for his accomplishments as president and even more so for all that he has done with his life since he left the White House. Even though he is not regarded by most historians as a successful president, I think it's safe to say that no president has accomplished as much as he has after leaving the White House. It could be said that he is a better ex-president than the president, but you better not say that in his presence because he doesn't like that. Through his leadership, the Carter Center in Atlanta has advanced the cause of peace, freedom, human and civil rights, environmental equality, the alleviation of suffering, and the rule of law in many countries around the world, all of which led to his being awarded the Nobel Prize in 2002. Perhaps at this point I should admit that I was not always as impressed by Jimmy Carter as I am now. As a Washington correspondent for the Night Reader newspapers, I covered the 1976 New Hampshire primary, and I was so certain that he did not have a chance of winning it that I did not bother to even spend a day covering him during the campaign. As I said, President Carter is a prolific writer. He's written 16 books at last count, more even than Professor Burns, or less than, not as many as Professor Burns, including his 1982 memoirs and his 1996 book, Living Faith, in which he discusses at great length his faith and religious views and how they affected his decisions as president. He has written countless articles and given numerous interviews dealing with the same subject. He was our first self-professed born-again president. He openly professed his belief in Jesus Christ as his personal Savior. This, by the way, was in stark contradiction to my former boss, Mr. Mondale, who I never once heard talk about his religious values in public and very seldom in private. It's just a difference in, I'm not being critical of him, it's just a difference in their styles. He comes from a Norwegian American background, and it is said in Minnesota that Norwegian Americans, if you get within 14 feet of them, you're invading their space. They're not revealing themselves easily. He grew up in a conservative Baptist family, and he taught Bible classes since he was 18 years old. One of the basic premises of the Baptist church faith is the separation of church and state. It is considered proper for citizens to influence public policy, but not for religious groups to try to control the processes of democratic government or to interfere in religious affairs. Actually, Carter tried to avoid being talking about his faith when he ran for president in 1976. In April of that year, he was at a home of a supporter in North Carolina and was asked a question, and he said then that he was a born-again Christian, but he was quickly discovered that became very controversial. He was criticized in the press for it, so he criticized for injecting religion into politics, and he realized that was a mistake. As a result, as president, he was always careful to separate his official status as president from the private worship habits of him and his family. He said, "I never permitted religious services to be held in the White House," and he wrote in an op-ed article in the New York Times in 1996, "Yet I prayed more during those 4 years than at any other time in my life, primarily for patience, courage, and wisdom to make good decisions. I also prayed for peace for ourselves and others. When Iran was holding our hostages, I asked for their safe return to freedom." Carter was once asked in an interview after leaving office whether God answered his prayers, and he said sometimes he answers our prayers with yes, sometimes he answers our prayers with no, and sometimes God might answer, "You've got to be kidding." Interestingly, in light of our current face-off with Iran over nuclear weapons, he said the greatest challenge of his life was the Iranian hostage crisis during his last year in office. He said, "The biggest crisis for me was to be patient and not to wipe Iran off the face of the earth with military powers, but to seek for and finally achieve a peaceful resolution to the crisis." Good advice, I think, for the current occupant of the Oval Office. Just for the record, Carter was also asked during the time of the Monica Lewinsky scandal about his infamous 1976 interview with Playboy magazine, when he confessed to having lust in his heart, and he said, "I don't have to talk about the definition of is to say I have indeed been faithful to my wife." For Carter, his religious faith was an ever-present reality that informed his every action as president, and I think as governor of Georgia. He said to have faith in something is an inducement not to dormancy, but to action. He wrote that in the introduction to his book, Living Faith, which incidentally has sold more than 250,000 copies. After the book was published, Carter was asked whether his Christian beliefs ever differed from his duties as president. He said, there were a few such conflicts, but I always honored my oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. For instance, I have never believed that Jesus Christ would agree with the Supreme Court decisions approving abortion or the death penalty, but I honored such rulings to the best of my ability, at the same time attempting to minimize what I considered to be their adverse impact. As Carter wrote in his 1996 op-ed in the New York Times, there is a subtle but important difference between the highest commitments of religious faith and public office. Most great religions espouse the golden rule based on agape, love or self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. But a government's ultimate goals are to preserve security and to ensure justice, to treat people fairly, to guarantee their rights, to alleviate suffering, and to try to resolve disputes peacefully. Both are worthy ideas, but neither is easy to reach. I'll conclude with a few comments about Peter Bourne. Peter Bourne is a former White House aide to Carter. He wrote a 1997 biography of Carter, which I think is the best one by far that's been written. He said, I think He said Carter's deepening involvement with his faith intellectually, emotionally, and practically gave him back a sense of meaning to his life after he lost his first race for governor and was deeply in debt. Increasingly, he conceptualized politics as a vehicle for advancing God's kingdom on earth by alleviating human suffering and despair on a scale that infinitely magnified what one individual could do alone. His most frequent prayer was that his life be meaningful in the enhancement of God's will and in the lives of fellow human beings. Thank you very much.
David?
Good morning. All credit for this conference belongs to Barbara Kellerman, and where Barbara is, she's here, floating about. So I appreciate the introduction, but believe me, the credit belongs to her. Well, Bryan was choosing up presidents to talk about. I think I may have wound up with the short end of the stick. Is that right? In this audience, please. You know, here in Boston, Cambridge, as you well know, the citizenry prides itself on thinking of this community as the cradle of democracy in America, the Athens of the West. Here, the citizens have always believed that if you put issues to voters, if you put candidates before voters, the voters would show infinite wisdom and should always be respected. And so it was on the day after this last election. The cry went up here in Boston from near and far, the people have spoken, the bastards. Here in Cambridge, I think that there is still a sense of loss and of concern and alarm even about the outcome of the election, what it says about this country, what it says about our president. And so much of that alarm focuses on the intense religious beliefs of the president and upon the mobilization of the Christian right in winning this election. I think it's well understood that had it not been for the Christian right, had it not been indeed for the various laws or ballot initiatives on gay marriage, that the election might have gone another way. So there, I think we meet in the midst of a lot of raw feelings about this, and I know a number of you are very concerned. In part, I think the concern comes because this is such a different president for us in contemporary times. With the exception of Jimmy Carter, our recent presidents have been extraordinarily private about their religious views, and many of them have worn them rather lightly. Ronald Reagan was an evangelical, and he said after his assassination attempt by John Hinckley that he believed that he was spared by God and that he owed the rest of his life to his Maker and that he hoped to devote himself to that. Seemingly then a man of strong religious views, but it is also true that Reagan was among those who took the practice of religion rather lightly. I well remember shortly before his first inaugural when he went to a religious service in Northern Virginia with his wife, and they had communion that Sunday, and he didn't know quite what the rules were of communion, so he kneeled down with Nancy and had her take the wafer first, and then she got the wine, and he watched as she accidentally dropped her wafer into the wine and did not know what to do and swallowed it. So when Reagan got his wafer and the wine, he of course dropped the wafer into the wine and swallowed it, believing that was what wine did. I think that is what we're more accustomed to among our presidents. And so along comes George W. Bush, a man who is very serious about his religion, who thinks his life was transformed by his own religious conversion, by his own change of heart, as the fundamentalists and evangelicals call it. And it's jarring for many people to think about this. And he indeed does, I think, practice religion in ways that we have not seen for a long, long time in the White House. He does read the Bible daily when he awakens. That's one of the, I think he reads it before he reads his the State of the World report from the CIA. I'm not sure, Joe, but I think that's the first thing he gets to in the morning. Joe used to They do national intelligence assessment for the agency, but the overnight briefing from the agency is, I think, second in his reading. You know, everybody has their different ways. When Reagan got up in the morning, he liked to read the newspapers, and he started with funny pages, you know, and then he went on to read the news. Well, Bush gets up and reads the Bible. And he also prays regularly. He conducts prayer services within the White House, and he has conducted prayer services on Air Force One when they're flying on a Sunday. On an international trip, there have often been prayer services on Air Force One. He is David Frum, his speechwriter, who wrote one of the first insider accounts, recalled in his book recently that first day he walked into the White House, coming over to the West Wing from the old DOD, that he was walking with somebody, and there was an exchange between two people. I didn't see you at the prayer service this morning. Why weren't you there at the Bible reading? And this is part of the common parlance now one finds in this White House. He opens his cabinet meetings with prayers. So we have then I think, an extraordinary and unusual degree of religious adherence that we have not seen much of. And there are many who believe he uses coded language to talk to his constituents. For example, in the debates this past year with John Kerry, and he was asked about what kind of appointments he would make to the Supreme Court. He made it very plain that he would not appoint any judges who would come out the same way on the Dred Scott decision. Well, I think most of us fell off our chairs. What in the world is he talking about? That decision is more than 150 years old. What's he talking about? Well, the Dred Scott decision to those in the right to life movement is a very, very important decision because it was about slavery. And they see Roe versus Wade in the same terms as Dred Scott. And this is so this is part of the language that people use. And I think there's no doubt that his religious views do carry over into his policy making. The faith-based initiative that he has proposed as a way to put money into local churches and use them as nonprofit agencies to tackle social problems, very plainly it's associated with his religious views, and he talks about them in that way. He talks about faith-based initiatives changing hearts. And to go back to it, the phrase changing hearts is a phrase that comes directly out of the conversion of people who were born again. They say their heart was changed. That's the phrase that people use in that among born agains. And the president frequently talks about the faith-based initiative in these terms. So there's no doubt it's pervasive. Now the question is what to think about it. How should we respond to this new religious sensibility we're seeing? Well, I'd like to make 3 points, because we're here to talk about moral leadership and religious practice. And the first one is, I think we should calm down a little bit about the president's religious faith. There is plenty of evidence that his religious faith, among other things, has strengthened his character. I believe that character is, as David McCullough said, character is the most important asset for a president. And it's very clear that while George Bush had a walk on the wild side when he was young, some would say a rather extended tour, that when he changed his life, that he found the anchors in his life in his family, his friends, and his faith. And if his faith is an anchor for his character, I think we should not be alarmed, by that alone. Secondly, I must tell you that there is lots and lots of precedent for presidents who take their religion seriously. We live in a more secular age, but for much of the history of the Republic, presidents took religion very seriously. George Washington gave his inaugural address. A third of his inaugural address is devoted to the role of Providence in American affairs. And when he took the oath of office in the Constitution, he added the words, "not in the Constitution, so help me God." And that phrase has been used by all presidents since. During the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening of the first half of the 19th century, religion became a very important part of American life. During the Civil War, there were 5 million Bibles printed during the Civil War for the soldiers, and almost every soldier took a Bible into battle with him. because they thought it would be a bridge between life and death to have that Bible there. And they had regular Bible meetings in the camps. Presidents who've come since then, Rutherford B. Hayes is one example. Certainly, Woodrow Wilson has been cited. They took their religion very seriously. William Howard Taft, it is said, was a Unitarian. And it is said that he refused the presidency of Yale because Yale had too many congregational ties. Religion just played a more central role for much of our history. And I think that most of us who look at it say, yes, there were excesses, but let's not. It also shaped the way people thought, acted, and indeed the way they put policy into place. And it is also true that in this president's case, I do believe he is a reflection of our times. Let's go back to Rick Warren and what Bryan said earlier. Rick Warren, who was here last night, he's the evangelical preacher who has become a phenom because he's, everybody here probably, how many here have seen the Michael Moore film? How many people here have seen the Michael Moore? How many have read the Rick Warren book? A couple, 3, 4. The Rick Warren book has probably had more influence in this country over the last year than has the Michael Moore film. It's just we're not part of that conversation that David Brooks has written. There are 2 conversations going on in the country. And the Rick Warren book, he sold 20 million copies, and as he pointed out last night in the forum, I did not know this. This weekend, or on any given weekend, you will find that 100 to 120 million Americans will go and participate in a religious service of some sort, whether it's Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, between 100 and 120. Warren made the argument that if you take that number alone on one weekend, it is greater than the number of Americans who go to sporting events over the course of the entire year combined. That is, I think, some indication of what is happening in the country and how religious an environment in which we find ourselves. And Bush is more a reflection of his times than he is, I think, almost anything else, and that one should be aware of that. Even here on our own campus, there are changes, and there are changes in campus communities all across the country. When Billy Graham came to this campus 10 or 15 years ago, it was a yawn. Most people paid no attention to it. When he came about 3 or 4 years ago, and Joe and I had him at the forum, the students slept out all night on the steps of Memorial Church. They could hear him on that Sunday morning. People are taking their religious faith more seriously and are expressing. Now, are there some caveats? Yes, there are caveats. I worry that his religious faith contributes to his black and white view of the world, especially in international affairs. There is a tendency among fundamentalists and evangelicals to see things in polarized terms, and they see good versus evil. So that for many who were thinking from the evangelical community, who were hearing about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, it did not make so much difference to them whether there were weapons or not. What they heard Saddam Hussein described as a force of evil. That's what they concluded, and they feel urged by the Bible to wipe out evil, and so it did not matter as much to a lot of people there. And I do think that is I think that one has to be careful about that. I also think that his whole notion of a crusade, and he only mentioned they used that word once, but there's no question that people around him feel that some of this war on terrorism is in effect a crusade, that Muslims are out to kill Christians and Christians have to get them first. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So that is a danger I think that one has to be guarded against. But I don't think there's a lot of us worry about what does he see himself as an instrument of God? Does George W. Bush see himself as an instrument of God? He knows God's will and he's carrying it out. He walks right up to that line a lot in his presentations, but I haven't seen any evidence he's gone over the line. He acts rather as if he's a servant of God rather than an instrument of God. He's trying to divine God's will rather than unknowing God's will, and I think that's a big difference in thinking about whether it's dangerous for him to believe as much as he does. The second point, I don't think we should be as overly alarmed as we are about the mobilization of voters through churches. A number of us watch this, and we know that we have students here at the Kennedy School. We actually have some Republican students at Kennedy School. And I talked to them when they went out and when they were out organizing in places like Florida this last year. They were asked to fill out weekly reports, not only on how many voters they had talked to or how many pieces of mail they had sent out, but they had to fill out a report. How many churches had they visited? How many pastors had they talked to? How many members of the congregations had they talked to? The Republicans kept a very close eye on this, and there's no doubt that they're mobilizing through the churches. And all of us feel, should we do that? Is that appropriate? Well, again, there's a lot of precedent going in this country, and most of the time, it has been in favor of things that presumably most of the people in this room support. The churches were a major source of dynamism to wipe out the slave trade. The churches and the religious awakening were a major source of activity to end slavery. And in our own time, it is true that John F. Kennedy tried to separate out. But the civil rights movement would not have succeeded had it not been for the mobilization of people through the churches. It was absolutely essential to the civil rights movement. And the black churches in particular, and Martin Luther King in particular, I think give evidence that folks have long turned to churches to organize. I think the problem for the Democrats is not whether this is bad or good. The problem for the Democrats is how do they mobilize their own voters? They shouldn't be so alarmed as sort of, and back in how do you get the people out? I think that's the big question for voters. And we come back to this. I want to close just on one point because I know time's running out. There'd be much more to say about this. I do want to point out that many of us here worry about the evangelicals and the fundamentalists being intolerant, pushing for social goals that we disagree with, whether it's on choice or world population or these other issues. And I appreciate that. But I also think that some of us sometimes in communities like this look upon them with condescension. I think we treat them as if they're second-class citizens, so they somehow don't get it, and we don't give them credit when they actually do go out and do things that we might applaud. For example, you pick up the New York Times today, and evangelicals there's a group of evangelical preachers now who are swinging behind the global warming efforts to curb global warming. Why? Because one of them was down scuba diving, and he was appalled by the loss of the coral reefs. And one of these evangelical preachers, he's now gotten up, mobilized others, and they're going to go out and try to help put their weight behind this. And by the way, they could change the Republican Party. They could bring the Republican Party behind Kyoto or something like it. It's alternative, which would be great. Rick Warren was here last night, and where was he going to go today? He's going off to Rwanda, Uganda, and Kenya to try to deal with issues of poverty and AIDS and the like, and how to get the churches more deeply engaged. And he's seen the presence of all three of those. So this is not. I think it's wrong-headed in this community to dismiss these people as sort of like, well, they don't get it, or they're somehow beneath the pale, or these, they're the people who carry guns, or whatever it may be. Finally, the final point I would make, just to add to this. Having said, let's calm down a little bit about the Bushes, the president's religious faith, and let's not get too over-worried about mobilizing through the churches. It's time for the Democrats to mobilize in other ways, which they can do. But it is also true that religious belief does not equal moral leadership. Just because one is of strong religious belief does not make one a moral leader. And I think that Bryan was pointing us in that direction before. We know that Richard Nixon was a man of strong Quaker faith. 1970, he was named Churchman of the Year by Billy Graham's group. Had all these religious services in the White House. And it's clear in retrospect that Nixon was a leader, but he was not moral. And we know, similarly with Jimmy Carter now, Eisele spoke so well of him, Jimmy Carter, as a president, was moral, but he wasn't always a leader. They don't necessarily go together, and I would point you to Franklin Roosevelt in particular, and Jim Burns has written more eloquently and more authoritatively on this than I could ever imagine. What he makes the point about Roosevelt, well, in his writings, what you find is that FDR didn't take his religion very seriously. He basically believed in the golden rule. That was the heart of the way he approached things. And he led many would look upon it today and say, well, A, he wasn't religious, B, there was Lucy Mercer in his life, C, he was very deceptive and manipulative in a variety of ways, getting us into the war in the way he did. But you know something? He also turned out to be a moral leader. And Jim Burns writes in particular about toward the end of his presidency how he moved from being a transactional leader to a transformational leader. that there were elements, especially in the State of the Union in 1944, in his other presentations, when he was trying to lift us up. And it seems to me, rather than trying to ask the question of whether people are religious or not, and does that make them moral leaders, we should go to Bryan Hehir's last point, and that is we should simply ask whether they're moral leaders, whether or not they're religious. And I think that that is the large question, and the Burns framework, whether they're transactional versus transformational, is a wonderful way to start trying to understand the question of whether people are moral leaders or not. Thank you.
Well, now we have time, obviously, for discussion. I've been asked to ask you that when you ask your question, if you'd introduce yourself. The floor is open. You can address questions to each of us or all of us. It's whichever is more helpful.
David Gergen, Carnegie Corporation. I'm interested in this whole context of having a nuanced and not over-the-top response to perhaps the prevailing religious climate in the White House. David Gergen's last comment, but religious belief does not equal moral leadership, takes me back to Bryan's question or observation in the beginning, and that is whether today, in the context of this discussion we just heard, a non-specifically Christian leader could be elected to the White House. I mean, there is a very valuable resource that those of us who deal with Congress have. It's called Congress at Your Fingertips. And in that little book, you have, of course, the district that the congressman represents. You have the committees on which he or she serves. You have the term with which they are serving. You then have spousal affiliation, which I suppose is some degree of interest. And then you have religion, as specifically set out in this directory of congressional membership. Intrigued by this inclusion, I went through the directory and found that there are very, very few members who don't have a religious affiliation specified in their profile. And so the question is, to the panel, I guess, and back to Bryan's original presentation, introduction, could someone who had in that little block, theist, be elected to the White House in the foreseeable future?
Allies spend a lot of time on the Hill.
Well, I would say that's an interesting observation. It does, the congressional directory, or the direct, not the official congressional directory, but many of the directories that are produced privately do list their members' religious affiliation, although you'll notice some of them have no religious affiliation. But short answer to your long question is that yes, I think it's entirely possible that somebody could be elected president who is not a Christian. Look at Joe Lieberman as an example, who was really the first serious Jewish candidate. Could have been a heartbeat away from the presidency had he been elected before. I don't, I guess we're a Christian nation, but I don't think that there's any. I don't think there's any bar to religious or even gender situation now for a presidential candidate. I mean, we have a very real possibility that Hillary Clinton could be elected president in 2008. She certainly is gunning for it. Somebody asked me the other day what her chances were, and I said, well, she's sleeping with the best political consultant in the world, so she probably has a pretty good chance. But my answer would be, I don't think that. I don't think it's a bar against being elected president because of what religion you have.
I would argue that in the current climate, when values trump economics in terms of voting behavior, that it's very unlikely someone will be elected who is not affiliated. But that does not mean that the climate won't change again, as it has so often in the past. If you look, I had reason to look this up the other day, and if you look over the course of American history, what George W. being the 43rd, we have had 6 presidents who have been unaffiliated in their religious attachments, starting with Andrew Jackson, who came during a fairly religious time, actually. But because of his war record, that trumped everything else.
I don't think I have much to add, except that I think it's really contingent on what's going on at the time, which could, 2008 could look very different than today does. We just don't know. So it's very difficult.
I was very interested in the categories you offered in your opening remarks, Bryan, and the observation that presidents might either collapse religion into their politics or separate it in what we tend to think of as the separation of church and state. Or the third category you offered was that it might somehow be mediated by putting religious or quasi-religious values in the clothing of moral claims. And I'm particularly interested, Mr. Gergen, in what you think Bush has done. Since I'm from the medical school, I should say I'm Christine Mitchell, I'm from the Division of Medical Ethics and work as an ethicist at Children's Hospital. What President Bush did on the stem cell debate was to ask his counsel for bioethics for advice and then take it in a really sort of odd position that allows researchers in at least NIH-funded labs to use already existing stem cells from already existing embryos, but not create embryos for stem cell research. Is this, something that characterizes Bush's style? Because otherwise, it seems as though he collapses a lot of his religious values into his politics.
Well, let me begin. The purpose of my distinction is twofold. One is that while I don't think all the issues that are contentious are moral in character, I think most of the issues that get discussed under the topic of religion and politics are in fact intrinsically moral issues. Now, when you go to solve a moral issue, you may well want to draw on a religious tradition, but it's also obviously the case, and you know, that you can deal with the moral content of very serious issues without reference to a religious tradition. So I think the value of mediating this dispute through the moral, first of all, opens the circle to people who feel at home in the debate across the line. Secondly, I think it not only opens the circle, it in fact gets you to the heart of the issue much more powerfully. And this goes to David's final point, that is to say, deep, powerful religious conviction, indeed authentic saintly character, doesn't guarantee good decision making. There is a way in which you need more than that, and there have been many saints in my tradition whom I would not want to be president, although they're good saints. And therefore, you have to search for a different dimension. Now, the other side, the other way to deal with this question, the sort of radical separation, what that often does is not only to keep religion separate from the discussion, it also often keeps the moral content separate from the decision. And I think part of the reason, to some degree, that the Kennedy speech of 1960, which was an extraordinarily effective speech at that point in the campaign in terms of what he had to do, I think in retrospect, it is not looked upon as an adequate answer to the question we're trying to deal with, partly because some of the vulnerabilities of the Kennedy policy, I think, for example, in Vietnam, the idea was that it was based on a kind of bureaucratic rationality, technological view of war and peace and issues without normative content, and therefore, in retrospect, there was something missing in the decision-making process. So if you need normative content, then the question is, what kind do you need? And that's where I go to religion mediated by moral discourse.
Just briefly, George Bush clearly is much closer to the collapsing end of the spectrum than the mediating end of the place. And that's affected stem cell research, which comes from his view.
I think it was over 70% of the American public said they thought faith was an important characteristic for them in judging a presidential candidate. And if from another side of the question, there was a discussion of if someone were an atheist, could they get elected in the United States? All of this permeated the discussion. Think back to 1960, a very different kind of setting for religion and politics. On the 40th anniversary of John Kennedy's death in 2003, the New York Times editorial memorializing Kennedy said that Kennedy's election had settled the religious issue in American politics. That did seem to be an overstatement of the question. That is to say, it settled a question, could a Catholic be elected president, but it seemed not to settle the issue of religion and politics. If anything, an alternative judgment would be that the issue today is far more pervasive and indeed is perceived as much more complex. The fact that it's far more pervasive, the role of religion in presidential politics, is troubling to many, mobilizing to perhaps just as many, and confusing to others. That is to say, the reaction to this question in its diversity is part of what needs to be analyzed. I think the first thing to say is that to discuss this topic today is to discuss it in a changed and changing context. And to highlight the change, let me use 2 points of reference. Namely, the 1960 election, when of course John F. Kennedy was elected president, and the election of 2004. In the election of 2004, the discussion of religion permeated the entire election period. Not only during the election, but since then. Last night, if any of you were here early, you might have gone to the ARCO Forum in the Kennedy School and heard a lecture entitled Election 204, A Spiritual Awakening, by a evangelical pastor who pastors a church with 80,000 people in Orange County and who has a book that has sold 20 million copies in the last 2 years. Now, when I was a graduate student here, the ARCO Forum did not feature spiritual awakening discussions. And so to some degree, there's a major change, even in this forum. But the change was deeper than that. The New York Times magazine section featured an article on President Bush's faith. Newsweek featured an article on Senator Kerry's character. The differences between 1960 and 2004, just if one looks at this almost at the surface of things. Religion and politics in 1960, I think, was regarded as an intrusion of religion into the political arena. Kennedy himself, for sure, tried to marginalize the issue. And when he finally addressed it openly and publicly, he did it against the advice of his advisors, if we are to trust the several biographies of Kennedy. His speech in Houston to the Ministerial Alliance was regarded as both necessary because the issue had become so significant and a huge risk. Kennedy solved the question by radically separating religion and politics. The purpose of his speech was to answer the question, could a person with his religious conviction, in a sense, be trusted in the American constitutional setting? And he answered the question on the whole by saying that while he held his faith and would not repudiate it, the content of his faith would not significantly or perhaps at all influence the way he would decide questions, and therefore the issue should not be a public fact of the election. In 2004, the issue was less how you insulated or isolated faith, but how you related it. How would a person's faith shape their choices? Now, the final comment, I think, of this is simply that this quick summary of a time when separation solved the question, and a discussion today about how relationship may be the question. A quick summary of that, I think, might be made in terms of 2 points. First, the levels of this question, religion and politics. I think there are 3. There's a personal level that tends to be about character, voters asking whether they should include religious judgments in assessing the character of candidates. Secondly, an institutional question, and the language of that is the language of the courts, the classical line drawing about church and state. It is a distinct question from the personal question, but not unrelated to it. And finally, in addition to the personal and institutional levels, there is what you might call the social level. That is to say, not what the character of candidates are, not how the institution of religion relates to the institution of government, but how in the social level one thinks about policy choices, whether they be war and peace, biomedical ethics, or questions of marriage and various. Be part of this conference, which I've been part of before, and it's always a rewarding experience. As you know, the title of this panel is Religion and U.S. Presidential Leadership. And what we plan to do in this panel is the following. I am joined on the panel by three colleagues, all of whom their bios are in your program. Jennifer Weber from the Department of History at Princeton, Al Eisele, the editor of The Hill in Washington, Capitol Hill, and of course David Gergen, to whom we are all indebted for this conference. The way we'll proceed is that I will make some opening remarks that will be thematic in character about this question, and then we will look at three cases, insofar as you can do cases in 10 to 12 minutes, because each of us are taking that. Jennifer Weber will look at Lincoln, Al Eisele will look at Carter, and David Gergen will look at George W. Bush. As you might guess, there were other possible candidates for this analysis. I really thought long and hard about trying to get the right person on Wilson, but we couldn't do it, and that seemed complicated enough to take a whole conference anyway. So we will stay with these three cases. Let me begin with a couple of remarks that are thematic, framing the question about faith and the present.